Very pleased to have at the end of the conference a session with CFTC Commissioner Summer Mersinger, and I believe you've been reappointed until 2028.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's great. Congratulations on that. Yeah. And what we plan to do is to have a discussion for, let's say, 30 minutes. And then leave 15 for your questions. Okay, so let me get started. First, Thank you for actually showing up at the conference and participating. The first question I've got is like a really basic question. We hear a lot about the SEC. Is crypto a commodity or a security? Why can't the CFTC just say it's a commodity and we're done? So can you explain?
I can, but before I jump into that, I always have to give a disclaimer because I am a government employee. So the views I express today are my own, and they do not necessarily reflect the commission, my fellow commissioners, or the United States government broadly. So with that. So why can't we just call everything a commodity, end all this speculation, and make this much easier for those in the market who would love to have some regulatory clarity here? It's a very straightforward question with a very convoluted answer. So I'll start a little bit with the jurisdiction of the CFTC, Commodity Futures Trading Commission. So we do not actually regulate commodities. We regulate the futures, the derivatives, the futures, the swaps, the markets that are a derivative of those commodities. And so I like to use cattle as an example because I grew up on a farm and ranch, and so it's what makes sense to me. But it's also, it's concrete. You can see it, you can touch it. So when you think about cattle's futures markets that are traded on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, we regulate those markets. But if you're just buying and selling cattle in the sale barn, we don't regulate the sale barn. The USDA does. Sometimes there is a federal regulator, sometimes there's not. So in those instances, USDA makes sure that things are done, properly at the sale barn, and we're just looking at the futures trading on cattle. There's a variety of cattle futures markets. Now, where this gets interesting, especially in crypto, is that we do have cash enforcement authority. So what that means is if somebody is committing fraud or manipulation in that cash market, so if somebody is just creating all kinds of fraud and manipulating the cattle markets, and they're actually been the ghost cattle herds and stuff, we can bring an enforcement action. So we can go in, our enforcement team can go in and bring an enforcement action saying that you are committing fraud or manipulation in the underlying cash market, because the integrity of those underlying cash markets are very important to properly operating derivatives markets. So when you apply that to crypto, we only regulate. So this is like everyday regulation, making sure people are registered properly, doing the proper oversight. We can only do that for crypto futures products. But if somebody is doing fraud and manipulation in just buying and selling the underlying crypto, we can bring an enforcement case. But when you think about enforcement, that means the fraud has already happened. Somebody's already caused some manipulation, and so somebody's already lost money usually. So now this does I do get to answer your question here. So when you're talking about why can't we just call it a commodity? Well, if we do that, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any everyday regulatory oversight of that market. So even if we say all crypto is a commodity, all that means is we have that enforcement authority, which we do have. Now, the other piece to this puzzle is the way the laws have always worked is, there's a lot of things that are commodity. Anything that's basically bought and sold in interstate commerce, except for onions and movie theater tickets, which is a subject for another conversation. Anything bought or sold in interstate commerce can be a commodity. including securities. So there are securities can be commodities. And so the way it's always worked is, yes, it's a commodity, but if the SEC comes in and says, this meets the Howey test, we believe it's a security, it is now deemed a security. And that's the problem that brings us to ETH, is this idea that we can call it a commodity, but if the SEC says it's a security, then it's treated as a security.
So the SEC trumps the CFTC.
Yes. It hurts a little bit to admit that, but yes, it does.
Got it. Okay, well, you mentioned enforcement, and it does seem like the regulatory approach is an enforcement approach. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the CFTC's approach to regulation by enforcement versus the SEC, and maybe are there situations where there's like joint enforcements where you get together with the SEC? So how does it actually work?
Yeah, there are a lot of times you'll see both of us bring a case. Binance, certainly FTX. So, there are a lot of times where we both bring cases, and we work together. But what's interesting is we end up doing this, asset by asset, and our teams will get together and say, we're going to say this is a commodity. We're going to, SEC say that we're going to say this is a security, and we'll bring the cases based on that breakdown. We have had more than one instance where we've said, you know what, we feel pretty strongly that this is not a security. And so this should come under our case. And the SEC said, no, we're going to go ahead and bring our case with it. And I think what our enforcement team has said is, you run some risk in doing that, because what if the court says, well, we don't think that's a security, so anything that happened with that particular asset could get thrown out, or the entire case. And so it's been a little tricky trying to balance with them, because it really is, you work together, but at the end of the day, they can file a case with whatever they think is security. And our practice has been, we don't want to duplicate. We will file our case based on whatever is left, just to make sure everything's covered. So, that happens, and that is tricky. I think the other interesting thing here, and one thing I've kind of asked is, if it's so clear how these are regulated, and everything should be, you just go register with the SEC, and these are all securities, and they're going to regulate you. Why are, up until recently, we've just seen mostly cases where fraud has happened. And so, I think now you're seeing where they're starting to ask, like, should you have been registered with the SEC? And that seems to be where some of their cases are going now. But some of their previous cases, you kind of had to ask, why, if that's the case, like maybe somebody should have got ahead of this, right? We couldn't have gotten ahead of it because we aren't allowed to step in, until there has been fraud and manipulation. So I think for the SEC, some of their regulation through enforcement has been this idea of, we're going to just say it's all securities, and now it's a little bit of this like, oh, and you should have registered here too. For us, it's more, we actually have that jurisdiction to come in and say, like, this, you couldn't have regulated, or you couldn't have registered to have us regulate you, but you're manipulating a cash market that influences, our futures markets. Now, where I've been a little bit frustrated with our enforcement actions is when we start stepping on some kind of policy issues, and that's really happened in the DeFi space. So, and part of that issue here is, how do you hold DeFi liable for, if somebody's trading a futures product on a DeFi protocol, yes, they should be registered with the CFTC, but who's to blame for that? Do you blame the developer? Do you blame the token holder? And we kind of got a little creative in a particular case where we said, we're going to go ahead and sue all governing token holders based on a state association law, and hold them liable that way. And we also posted on a chat room basically the notice that they were going to be held liable. That really bothered me, because to me, that was 100%, because we didn't know how to handle it, rather than saying, there's really not a legal framework for this. We're just going to come up with what we think works best and use that as our theory for this case. To me, those are policy decisions that need to be made by policymakers. And we've also had what we call DeFi sweeps, where we've gone to DeFi protocols. We've said, you have futures trading, you're not supposed to. We're going to charge you for failing to register. And they'll say, great, just tell us how to register. And we'll say, oh, we don't really have a category for you to register in. Again, it's not how things should be done. And then you end up with court cases or settlements telling everyone what the law is, when really the law wasn't ever, didn't anticipate this technology and this innovation.
So talk to me a little bit about the sort of threshold for an enforcement action. And I know recently there's been some controversy within the CFTC with Commissioner Pham suggesting the GAO audit the previous enforcements. So what is the threshold?
Yep.
Because what are the trade-offs, the economic trade-offs? Because I think one of the goals is that we want to innovate, but of course not at any cost.
Yep. It is tough, because when it gets to the commission, just to give you a bit of the mechanics here, we have a very large enforcement team. In fact, the largest part of our agency is enforcement. And so they're always building cases. They've got investigators, they've got lawyers, we've got a robust whistleblower program. And so they have all this information coming in, and they're constantly building these cases. By the time we vote on them, they're pretty much ready for prime time. So if it's a settlement, that settlement is done. Now, we can vote against it, and that puts our attorneys in a really bad spot, because they got to go back and say, oh, we said this settlement was agreed upon, just kidding. But, for the most part, when they're bringing us a case, to whether it's to file it, whether it's to, to settle, to ask for even subpoena authority, everything's pretty well laid out. They've developed their evidence. They think they have a strong case, and it's ready to go. So it does kind of put us in a position of take it or leave it, I guess. And so that's why you do see, some frustration, because you feel like you're asked. Sometimes you look at these cases and you think, well, yeah, there's bad behavior here, and we shouldn't allow this. Maybe we should do something, but the legal theory maybe it's not the strongest. And so that's where you see some frustration and some criticism. And that was part of, going back to the Uki Dow case that we had. I was frustrated, not because I didn't think somebody should be held liable for what was being done, because the gentlemen who created this, they were violating our statute. We said you're violating our statute. They settled with us, and then they created the DAO. They went on YouTube and said, we've now made this CFTC proof. And, and then left it to the token holders to be, liable, because that's what we decided. And my thing was, we could have charged them with aiding and abetting. So there were other ways to kind of, get to it that we chose not to. And, those are the types of frustrations that you hear. So, again, it's just kind of the mechanisms of our enforcement cases, that they really are pretty well packaged by the time they get to the commission. And so if we have differing opinions, we're a little bit limited in what can be done.
Okay, so you mentioned enforcement. You also mentioned policy.
Yep.
So I'm curious about the degree of interaction between the CFTC and the policymakers. And you've got a unique background working in the House, being Deputy Chief of Staff for Senator Thune. So what is the connection? Because it seems, at least from my perspective, it'd be ideal to have policy guidance in general.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think, because of my unique background, I really do value the kind of the legal theory that there are certain public policy decisions that are best left in the hands of Congress. They're not for unelected regulators to make. They are for the elected officials to make. And I do think in crypto, this is an area where this is ripe for the elected officials to make the decision of who is going to be that cash market regulator. And so our interactions, actually, I think we've got a great case study right now, the FIT21 bill that just passed the House yesterday. So as they were creating that bill, they had, at one point in time, I was up in front of House Republican Agriculture Committee members and Republican Financial Services members. I was up there with Commissioner Hester Peirce from the SEC, and the two of us explained our jurisdiction, our enforcement, just how the agencies work. And then later they called me back with Commissioner Pham. We walked through a number of issues again related to crypto, and so we do work pretty closely with Congress. Same thing on the Senate side, whether it's our agency is funded by Congress, and so we do have to go up and talk about funding needs, staffing needs. So it's definitely, we interact with them quite a bit. I have my personal opinion is it's not our job to tell Congress whether or not they're doing things right or wrong or their approach is wrong. I think some at the SEC have a different view of that, but we're there to help them. If they write bills, they'll often send them to us and say, does this work? Are there things that we need to change because it wouldn't work? And we try to offer that assistance. But it's certainly you get better law and it's easier to implement if Congress and the administration kind of work together ahead of time.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the administration.
Yep.
So President Biden initially said that he would veto the FIT21. Now it's been downgraded to the White House doesn't like it, but maybe some work could be done. And maybe it was a bit surprising the number of Democratic representatives that voted in favor of FIT21. So do you see, again, you've got this perspective, do you see the tide is turning a little bit, and maybe no coincidence that it's election year?
I was just going to say, I don't know if the tide's turning, but it is an election year. And that is very important because you have seen former President Trump begin to embrace crypto enthusiasts, crypto investors. I think that's very intentional because they feel very pushed out by the Biden administration. So I think some of this kind of back and forth from the White House is probably election year politics. Their statement on FIT21 was very much like, well, we don't really like this bill, but they acknowledged that something needs to be done. That was a very big deal because you also had a statement from Chairman Gensler saying nothing needs to be done. I got it. It's all we can handle this at the SEC. So you even have kind of I think people would say no. Both the White House and the SEC chair were against the FIT21. But in my view, just given my background, I saw some very important distinctions between their positions on this bill. And to your point of that got more support than expecting, we get clips every day, and I read them backwards where I read today's clips and then yesterday's clips. Well, I think yesterday everyone was saying, gosh, they might get 40 Democrats. I think it's 71, something like that. So it really surprised a lot of people how well and how bipartisan this bill was yesterday. And I think between that and the Congressional Review Act vote on the SEC staff bulletin for crypto custody, that is a huge signal to the administration that maybe the way they have been headed with this generally with crypto and with blockchain and with all of, kind of when you look at how we've been handling it, maybe they're headed in the wrong direction, and it's not a good direction to be in when you're going into a very tight election.
Got it. This is I'm curious about the following. The CFTC's got a lot to do.
Yep.
How much time is actually devoted to crypto? Just roughly like a percentage. It obviously gets a lot of media attention, but I just don't know. And kind of the second part is something I said a little earlier. that the goal obviously is to protect,
Yeah.
but not at any cost. We want to actually innovate.
Right.
So kind of the second part is I noticed that the CME wants to do like spot Bitcoin, but not in the US.
Yeah.
So, and that is the worst scenario where good ideas move offshore.
Yeah.
So could you talk to that balance and how much time is actually devoted to this?
Well, after I was first appointed and confirmed, I was always joking that it was like 99% of my time was crypto. And, at the time it was because we really, we were a newer commissioner. The chairman had just been confirmed as a permanent chairman. So honestly, we were just kind of getting up and going. And so we weren't deep in rulemaking and we were just dealing with enforcement. So it certainly, that was also, the FTX application was live. And so it was just a ton of kind of crypto related, work. Now, I think we're probably much more on the kind of traditional markets, that's probably 70% of our time, and then 30% is crypto. But I do think there's kind of a misperception here, and I think people, even in my own agency, maybe, cause this. We talk about like our enforcement being largely crypto, or well over 50% crypto. But that's a little unfair because a lot of it's just fraud. People call it crypto fraud, but there's no crypto bought or sold. They just said, I'm going to buy crypto. You're going to make a ton of money. Give me your money. They take your money and they run. That's no different than like metals fraud, or, it used to be, certainly we've seen it in, they love to do this with gold too. I don't know why, but it's like gold and crypto are the two biggest, where you just see people losing a ton of money and there was never any item purchased. So to me, I'm like, well, is that really fair to call it all crypto fraud? I'm like, it's just, next week it'll be AI fraud. It's whatever is the term of the day that lets fraudsters convince people to give them their money, and then they just misappropriate it, they take it for themselves and run. So, it's, crypto fraud, but it's really just, we get a lot of fraud cases.
So I've got two more questions, and we'll kind of open it up. So the first one is that crypto is like a global commodity. And the Uniswap Labs kind of response to the Wells notice really made this point that only 7% of what we do is under U.S. jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, do you see things outside of the U.S. in terms of best practices that the CFTC learns from? And do you talk to fellow regulators in the EU or the UK?
Yeah, and actually I think this is another kind of piece to why the CFTC would be a good regulator of this markets that I think doesn't get talked about a lot, is we regulate global markets. All of our markets are global. We talk to our counterparts in the EU, the UK, Singapore, Japan. I mean, we're dealing with our international counterparts on a daily basis. You often will see us overseas, and a lot of times it's just because they're overseas events, but it's U.S. and it's all the jurisdictions coming together. And we'd also go to a lot of places that are just starting our markets, and we help them build. We'll send people with USAID into countries that are trying to create these markets. So we're very global, and I think that makes us unique, and that makes us, we're kind of in a good position to really oversee these markets because they're so global. And, you pick up on things. I do think, everybody's trying to figure this out. I don't think anyone's going to get it completely right, or completely right on the first try, but you try to take best practices. And so you just, you hear what's working, what's not. I think one piece that I picked up, I was talking to some folks from Singapore and their monetary authority, and they said, one thing that we put in place is we wouldn't let people do leveraged transactions on cryptocurrencies with credit cards. Now, I don't know how I feel about that, but I'm like, that seems like an interest, it'd be interesting to see how that works. Does that help protect certain clients who, might get over their skis on being over leveraged in these markets, on credit. So, there are pieces that you pick up from international regulators, but I think we have that dialogue all the time now, and I think that's really important, and it's just something that nobody really brings that up as part of the, when they talk about CFTC versus the SEC, but I think that's one of the pieces why it makes a lot of sense for our agency to be overseeing these markets.
Okay, my last question has to do with the sort of mechanism whereby innovators can contact the CFTC and ask them, do you think this is okay? Is that fairly easy to do? And kind of the second part of that is, are there interesting kind of blockchain-related tech things that are happening before the CFTC that you could actually talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have a very open door policy. We used to have what was called Lab CFTC, which was kind of where people would come in the door. But what we realized is, it was an all of CFTC effort to, when innovators would come in the door, our Lab CFTC would say, we need to bring people from this division and this division. And so now we've kind of said, come in, show us what you're doing. We'll make sure the right people are there, and we'll discuss it. And if there's a way to register, we'll figure that out. But we've always been an agency that works very closely with our stakeholders because we are a market regulator. We are looking, at markets more broadly, looking at, okay, what works, what doesn't, what are they seeing? We work very closely with our registered entities, even with our enforcement team. Sometimes CME will bring an enforcement case, and they'll bring that information to us. And so working with stakeholders is just part of our nature. We're also, because we have what are called principles-based regulations, we have very broad outcome-based principles where each, registered entity or registered exchange can kind of set the rules and the parameters in the way that they see best works for them to fit that overall overarching principle. And then a lot of them, there's a lot of what we call self-regulatory requirements. And so a lot of our stakeholders actually have a regulatory function. So again, that's why we have to work so closely together. And so it's very natural for the CFTC to work with stakeholders. And so we've always said, come in and talk to us. Tell us what you're working on. Tell us, if you're worried, just come in and talk to us. We are not the agency that will follow up with a Wells notice after you leave or a subpoena after you leave. That's not what we do. So we have a very open door policy, and we work very closely with stakeholders. And then on your question about blockchain uses, it's not something we have figured out internally in the agency to use. I mean, I think government was like the last even adopters of smartphones. There are people still holding on to their BlackBerries till the very last minute. So, finding a blockchain use case in the government, we're not quite there. But we see a lot of industry coming in and showing us how they're using it. And probably where I'm seeing it a lot right now is in the voluntary carbon markets. So, they have that problem of validation of, these credits have to be retired. How do you make sure that they are retired and somebody doesn't try to repurchase it? And you're seeing that blockchain is that area. And that is really important for our registered exchanges that have futures on these voluntary carbon markets, because they have a duty to make sure that whatever they're basing these products on, that there's not, something where this is likely to be manipulated. And so they need those assurances too, that there's not going to be, kind of a carbon credit that gets passed around and never retired. So that's a use case that we're seeing more and more. A lot of our registered markets, when you talk to them about blockchain, they'll say, we have small use cases within our business, but broadly, because financial services is just so highly regulated anyway, until they have nobody's going to go out and change their entire business model and put everything on the blockchain. They're going to start small and move up. So I think the most interesting place, like I said, is voluntary carbon markets, and it's probably because there is no real regulator there.
That is true. So nobody has actually pitched like a centralized automated market maker.
No, not yet, but at least not a regulated one.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So let's open it up for questions, and let's see at the back, the first one.
We're expecting a decision in the Looper Bright Supreme Court case regarding Chevron deference.
Yep.
Any day. I was wondering if you thought about, and crypto was brought up multiple times in the oral arguments as like this, this kind of example of a regulatory overreach. I'm curious what your thoughts on that, and given that it's likely to be reversed or overturned, what do you think? What will be the impact on the oversight of crypto and specifically CFTC and crypto?
Yeah, no, that's, I think, such an interesting case, and I think that's going to really change the way that all regulators do rulemaking. I think it's going to mean that we're going to be much more careful and follow the statute, which to me is a very good thing. I am always one who says, let's go back and look at what the statute says. Let's not add words. Let's not take words away. And so we're all watching that very carefully. And it's part of this kind of broader trend that we're seeing in this, almost a judicial questioning of, administrative state and how powerful we can be. So we're, and I think that's going to play into crypto for sure, because the SEC has been very aggressive, and there's a lot of court cases out there on, how they are using their administrative power, where there is, not kind of legislative intent yet. But we're seeing it, and it's again, I'm finding a lot of people who are interested in crypto are interested in what these event markets, these prediction markets. So we oversee these markets in the U.S., and we have kind of two court cases pending right now. Both are one's actually just got sent back to the Fifth Circuit. And, it has to do with, this is staff action, it's called a no action letter, and whether or not that could be considered a license. And again, this is the question of, has the administration, have the regulators been stepping over their skis and kind of stepping on what is public policy and what should be decided by legislation, what can you do within your statute, and when are you going too far? So, we're definitely watching that. There's a lot of kind of administrative law lawyers in DC who are just so excited because this is, the first time that there has been, kind of a real question around a lot of administrative actions. And, I think it's one of a number of cases that everybody's been watching closely, and it really is kind of a changing tide a little bit on, maybe the administrative state has gotten too big and too powerful, and it's being scaled back. So we'll see, but yeah, definitely on our horizon, and I think it will have an impact on how crypto is handled.
Coast?
You mentioned, fraud can happen. Fraud happens in gold,
Yep.
Fraud happens in crypto. But I wonder that, just thinking back to the days when they started trading derivatives, for example,
Yep.
options and futures and all that. At that time, there was a relative difference in the sophistication of the players.
Yeah.
And as you know, there were regulation on position limits or regulation on maybe disclosure requirements. So I sort of think of that as the crypto scene. There is a relative difference. It's complex, and therefore relative differences in the sophistication of the initiators versus other players who are just there. So I don't know whether that warrants some kind of precautions and regulations and things like that.
Yeah, it does, and I think that's why it is important that we have Congress creating some sort of legislative framework here, because I think if anyone wants to trade in these markets, let's give them a safe place to do it, and let's make sure that when they're walking into these transactions, it's on a level playing field, and that they have all the information that they need, and that they have the disclosures and protections, customer segregation and of money and those things that you would want anybody to have, but certainly someone who is maybe not, it's a little bit of a different, that what you'd consider more of a retail customer versus an institutional customer. And so I think in crypto, that's part of the reason that, I do think we need some probably rules and a framework so that we can create a safe space so that there is regulation over the cash markets. And then if people do want to invest, they have at least some protections and rights going into it. So that's where we are right now. And yeah, you do worry about if we don't, people are finding ways to access these markets overseas, and then we don't know if those protections are in place. And so that's another reason why it's really important that we do this in the U.S.
Jim?
Speaking of customer protection, I think the FTX case is a nice example of U.S. protection. Can you tell us what it was like on the inside dealing with, or is now dealing with the U.S. branch of FTX, and how U.S. Customers of FTX have fared compared with customers in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was even, I think, even more interesting for the CFTC because FTX did own a registered clearinghouse, LedgerX as we knew it. And so when this was all happening and there was questions of where's the money, where's the customer money, at least for us with LedgerX, we knew where it was because we had segregation protections there. We actually would look at their bank account and say, is that money there? Yes, we had regular interactions with them. Our examiners could go in at any time and say, where's the customer money? It's right there. So for us and the piece of FTX that we regulated at the time, they did have a pending application to do kind of a more broad transactions, but based on what they were approved to do through LedgerX, we knew exactly where that money was. We knew how much it was, and there was no question around that. So for us, we were very comfortable in how things would turn out for anybody who somehow had dealings with LedgerX. But on the other side, when you looked at the cash, the buying and selling of Bitcoin, I think there was more of a question there of where is the money. But I think this was a great example of how our bankruptcy regime works and does the most that it can to get money back to the customers who were in trouble here. And so, again, if you're offshore, I mean, I don't know what the bankruptcy protections are for, customers in other jurisdictions, but I don't know how this would have looked if this was under a different jurisdiction. If U.S. customers would be getting as much back as they are. I only knew that they would get as much as possible because the U.S. has a very vigorous bankruptcy code. So it was, again, it's that idea that you don't want to let go of these markets. You might not like them, but it's better to have them regulated and under our law than U.S. persons finding ways to access these markets overseas and having no protections whatsoever.
Yeah, so just to follow up on LedgerX,
Yep.
and I want to seek your insights about this, because when we look into LedgerX, and first of all, it's very helpful that it protects the U.S. customers. On the other hand, the option trading volume and the liquidity on LedgerX is pretty bad, and then over 90% of the option volume is actually on derivatives, which is not regulated in the U.S. So when we look at this, we were wondering whether it's kind of maybe indication of over regulation, but I just seek your opinion, like why LedgerX is not just doing that well.
So LedgerX is interesting because part of the reason that you didn't see a lot of liquidity there is because it's the clearinghouse. It's required to be fully collateralized, and people don't love that. They don't, you don't always want to put up dollar for dollar. The real activity, especially in crypto, has been on the leverage side, and LedgerX had to be fully collateralized. And that was actually what FTX application before us is this idea of moving from a fully collateralized model to allowing some leverage transaction. So, I think that was just the way that they were set up, and that's why we didn't see the liquidity there. But there is that question of, again, I go back to the prediction markets, because that's a question here. If we're too harsh and we say you can't do all of these contracts, there's a lot of people doing this that are not regulated, and the money's just going to flow there. And so are we going to create a situation where we've over-regulated and actually made it so that the people who have come in and registered with the CFTC just will never get the market share because we've been too strict? And it's a balancing act that we are trying to deal with all the time. And so it's one of those where I don't think the answer is no regulation, but it certainly is something we have to think about when we are proposing regulation, especially when you're seeing new markets creep up and new ideas coming on the scene. How do you manage that without going too far? And that's why our principles-based regulation has worked really well. You think about, we had open outcry, floor trading of our futures and derivatives products for years. And then electronic trading came on the scene. Our principles allowed those two functions to kind of work together, and you could be a floor trader or you could be an electronics trader. It didn't matter, as long as you kind of abided by our overarching, this is the outcome we want. And then over time, the efficiencies of electronic trading took over and the floors went away. But if we were too rigid, that would have never happened. And so that's what we want to be able to do, is put these principles in place so it doesn't matter the technology that you're using. That there's a regulated space, it's safe. But we don't go too far to make it so that nobody even wants to access, or that you can't bring products to the market that people want to invest in. I don't know the answer. I don't know how you get there. That's just what we try to do anyway. Sometimes we get it wrong sometimes.
So the last question, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
I'll ask. So a lot of what we talked about is centralized
Yeah.
crypto. You did mention a few things in decentralized finance, but it seems like the overwhelming focus is on centralized. FIT 21 says very little about decentralized finance, and the EU regulations kind of the same thing. Is there room for the CFTC to at least give guidance so that we can avoid future unnecessary enforcement actions in this space? Because I don't see anytime soon Congress coming up with the DeFi frameworks.
Yep. Yeah, I think DeFi has eluded everyone a little bit, because it is, again, that question of if you're saying it's just a program, it's just a protocol, who's to blame if somebody's trading a product that you're supposed to be registered to be trading it, and do we even, should we even care? I think there's some people who look at this. It's just, again, regulators, we take something very technical and interesting and we bring it down to like the most basic level. And I've heard people talk about it, is this just like people going into a yard sale and buying and selling and stuff? And somebody might have a bad product and charge too much, but we don't care because they're at a yard sale and whatever. I've heard DeFi looked at that. It's very, very unsophisticated way to look at it. But I have said to our team, especially our enforcement team, if we are going to bring enforcement actions and say, we're charging you because you failed to register, then we better tell them how they can register. And even if and that might take rulemaking, and we could do that. We did that with around foreign exchanges. You know, the buying and selling it. You know, with foreign exchange rates, because you know that's not immediate delivery. There was some time, and so we said, oh, it's close enough to what our markets do, and so we kind of created this new registration category for just people who are just doing foreign exchanges. And so I think we could do that with DeFi. And I've asked the chairman, I've asked our teams to look at it. You know, I don't know if the appetite is there right now, but I'm going to keep pushing, and certainly as we see enforcement actions, I'm going to keep hammering on this idea that it is inherently unfair to bring an enforcement action against something where we have never said how you can comply with our rules. And you know, most of the time, special, you know, Okida was a special. They were doing stuff they shouldn't have been doing. But you know, our other DeFi cases, I don't think anybody set out to break our rules, and I think a lot of them didn't want to break our rules, and they wanted to know how to follow them, and we just said, sorry, you can't. Now pay us money and close down. That to me is not at all how we should operate.
Well, that is a good place to end off. Thank you very much. I hope that, I was checking my phone. I thought maybe the SEC would announce the ETF during our talk.
Wishful thinking.
Yeah, exactly. But thank you very much for coming to the conference and sharing your insights.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you.